Thank you very much to Mr. Lawrence for having me. So I do apologize if it seems like I'm reading a lot off my paper. I'm also dealing with some schoolwork assignments. Yeah. Um, right. So the first part of this presentation will be a bit qualitative, just to set the context. And in major part, it's not just my work; it's also work that we do as a group at Concordia University of Montreal. It's also a bunch of PhD students and master students, and we all come together and try to put our work together. Right, so I guess we can move forward. Just to start off as a context, our thinking is essentially that before we can make any larger predictions or find what to quantify, we wanted to start with a context of a sequence to warfare, kind of like in a war game. So first, we thought about the preparation phase of any invasion towards Taiwan and how likely it would be detected through satellite imagery or any number of methods, as such a large movement of manpower and the high requirements and heavy equipment will likely not go unnoticed. And this has implications later to some of the kind of modeling that we try to do, where we don't really believe a surprise is possible, especially in terms of a larger landing. Then we move on to the opening salvo, which isn't just the opening salvo, it's also the continuation of strikes that China would conduct on Taiwan to trick their air forces and their land forces before invading. This is a project that's not entirely done. I was hoping to have it finished by now, but it's way too large. It involves quantifying airfields, looking at hardened air shelters, and anything that we could put into numbers. Yeah. So moving on, we have the air supremacy phase, which we believe would be crucial to China because any invasion of Taiwan would not be in their favor, especially numerically. And as I will show later, they will be constrained by the places where they can land in and the beaches. So they will necessarily need that kind of air power to supplant the effort. But there are some caveats there. Naval supremacy, the role of this and its importance will be discussed later in a presentation that I have with Professor Spencer Churchill at 2:30, I believe. This presentation will focus on the amphibious operation and how that might happen, and some of the work we're doing to try to understand it better. So, thank you. First, to continue with that context that we set of what may happen on the sequence, I have some crucial cases that I wanted to mention. Did I close this? Thank you. First, we begin by looking at Corbett and Mahan. And Mahan believes that sea control would be enough to achieve victory, but Corbett disagrees with him and believes that you do in fact need a land invasion, which also has control of the seas to be logistically resupplied. So moving on. Second, we moved on, and we thought it was crucial to mention that air power alone, we do not believe, can win the war. And for that, I think there's a great example in Robert A. Pape's book, Falling to Win. As he puts it, the air power did not succeed in coercing Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait, but it did so by undermining its ability to defend against the coalition's ground threats. We believe that the air power will be crucial for China, but it will not be decisive on its own. Next, we have the Gulf War the Gulf War Air Power Survey. I have a colleague who's doing a significant amount of work on that. He hasn't let us know what yet, but the idea is we'd like to do the same for Taiwan, at least in a predictive sense, because it'd be such a large operation, logistically and planning-wise, that we're not even sure the Chinese are capable of doing it, and they are. And if they are, there's some ground rules that certainly we believe we could find in that. Moving on. So second, we have right. This is part of what I wanted to mention before of the project that's not completely done yet on the role of Air Force and hardened aircraft shelter and attritive Taiwanese forces. NATO did significantly struggle in Kosovo to conduct suppression of enemy air defense, and while I have it here, NATO reportedly fired 743 harm radiation missiles, but can only confirm the destruction of 3 of the original 25 SA-16 batteries. At the same time, over 800 SAMs were fired by Yugoslav forces and NATO aircraft for the downing of only 2 aircraft and several more damage. Right, and so we believe this is important because
I'm gonna get my bus. No.
right, so we believe this is important because it has implications for those air assets that China desperately needs when it's conducting its amphibious operation. They may be bogged down doing combat air patrols or suppression of enemy air defense, and as we've seen in Kosovo, um, Taiwan has a significant amount of massive deployments dispersed and effectively make it very difficult for China to move those assets away, or at least restrict them in some sense. And here we have one of the few things I could find on air superiority in Ukraine and Russia, which I believe is fairly interesting. And essentially, the paper is interesting because it talks about how there should be greater integration between the Air Force and the ground personnel, but as well as the ground-based air defense units, which should be better integrated with the ground forces. So, moving on. Right. So now to get into the kind of wargaming we do, which I believe is important because it's for us the kind of first step into quantifying stuff. Yeah. So for over 26 years now, Professor Spencer Churchill has been running these wargames every weekend with his students. And they're done in cooperation with the Strategic Diplomatic Society, which allows us to get some funding and to kind of expand this into a student organization at our school. For us, however, the current focus for the past year, has been trying to figure out how an amphibious landing on Taiwan would work, and further, to understand the systems that the authors of these games use and many more, so we could create our own and see where they lack. Further, another reason why these wargames we believe are important is because they quantify and they also simplify the complex nature of all the equipment that we're going to see utilized at the same time, which is kind of very hard to imagine until you can physically kind of act it out, we believe. So, right, so just to kind of start describing them, this is Abandoned Fleet, a Japanese game which we had to translate the rules for and kind of put together ourselves. It was fairly interesting. The order of battle and the distribution of units was pretty accurate. I believe that the system used was Joe Balakowski's Fleet series, which we see there. It was something very similar to with its own differences, and the reason we thought that was important and interesting because it did do it in a current scenario. So further, we have Next War Taiwan, which we also played, but that I will criticize a bit later. Not that I don't like the Next War series, we think it's great, but we think it's part of a kind of a trend in these current war games in ignoring some of the important features in Taiwan, especially in regards to terrain. As you can see here, it looks like everything's kind of a beach, and it's kind of the same in Next War Taiwan. And lastly, we have Sea Power in the State, made by Stephen Newberg for Simulations Canada, which we thought was very interesting for us because it allowed us kind of to. It's during the Cold War, but it kind of gave us a baseline which we could model the distribution of U.S. assets on 2 fronts, or in the case of facing a crisis in one part of the world and also having to deter China in the other. So, moving on. This is probably our most interesting wargaming project that we've done yet. It's called Coming Wave, and the reason it's interesting is it was made by Kilovolt Studios, which is likely associated with the PLA. So, the game was completely in Chinese. We had to translate every rule book, and we've been working at it for 3 months, and we still have some details to get to. But it's fairly interesting, especially in regards to the amount of research they did to get it together. I mean, see, these cards right here, each one represents a naval base or an air base or an aircraft carrier, and it has its own values of resistance, the operation that can be conducted in whatever else. The game took us about 8 hours to set up. length of the map is huge. This is the route we usually use, and we had to get all the tables together to do it. And this is the distribution of Taiwanese assets, which I actually believe is fairly correct, especially in regards to surface-to-air missile systems. We kind of did our own research on that to figure it out, and it seems the Chinese have a pretty good idea of where stuff is. Uh, but again, something we don't like and we don't really understand is this nature and just quantifying everything as kind of a beach. Even here, yeah, it makes it seem like you could land on a nice sunny beach there and move right into Kaohsiung, which, as we'll find out, is not the case at all. So, right. So this is a project that I've been doing on my own for a few months now, and it's still ongoing. But this is what we currently have. What we did is basically we surveyed the terrain of the Taiwanese coast to figure out exactly what China may face. And what we found out is that satellite imagery can look kind of deceptive. A lot of it is aquaculture in water or fish ponds that look just like this. And it lines the whole coast. So this is the 93-kilometer extent of what we did. And the reason that's pretty interesting for us, especially in regards to Kaohsiung, is because a CSIS wargame that they did predicted that 21 times out of 24, Chinese would land in the south due to lower amount of defenses. And when it's put in that term, in those, sorry? Oh.
I was just gonna say, no, they're not saying.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, good luck driving a tank in there.
Yeah. Yeah, so when it's put into those terms, it seems like the invasion has a lot of opportunities, but at a closer glance, it's much more restrictive than it may actually seem. So on the next one.
It's more like Holland.
Yeah, kind of. So this is a pretty interesting example that I could come up with in the 1965 Battle of Asalutar, where the Indian troops flooded a sugarcane field. And the next morning, the Pakistani tanks of the 1st Armored Division were lured into it and basically went into a horseshoe trap where the swampy ground essentially slowed their advance, and they lost around over 100 tanks for the loss of only 20 Indian tanks. So moving on. So this is kind of a map that we put together. I know it doesn't look too great, but it's meant to show the distribution of water along the whole coast. And essentially, when you look at it that way, and the fact that you are going to have to make a beachhead and advance, we kind of only see 3 scenarios where this really works out well for the Chinese, and they're not bogged down. So this is Kaohsiung. This is a district which its name I forgot, and I believe that's Tainan. So right, and here, for example, here it's not possible to land because you have a mountain, and there you have more aquaculture that simply wasn't well defined by the software I was using at the time. So yeah. So this is Kaohsiung, and the lines are meant to represent the one going up is 7 kilometers, and this one is 35 kilometers. The reason this is important, and we thought we'd draw it out that way, is because that CSIS wargame that they did, 1 hex is about 30 to 35 kilometers. So essentially, this whole thing would be just 1 hex in their wargame, which we believe is a bit reductive, and it's part of our ongoing attempt to look at Taiwan in a more tactical manner, aside from the strategic and operational level that people are kind of accustomed to look at, which we don't believe fully represents the exactly what could happen. So next one, please. Right, so this is not the best thing I ever did, but it's kind of a proof of concept that we wanted to put together. Those are ranges, and I went through different attempts of trying to do a Monte Carlo and all this, but there's too many variables. Essentially, I took the average of each range and tried to put together a model which could kind of look at the attrition rate. So I can kind of explain some of it. So the sophistication factor for Taiwan, we predict will be quite low, and higher for China in the event they get air superiority. But China could also suffer from it if they do not manage to put all their assets towards air superiority and instead have to dedicate them to stuff such as suppression of enemy air defense. We assume Taiwan will have a major mobility advantage because they're not China landing on a coast, and Taiwan has the opportunity of maneuvering. Defending forces are not a wild guess, which, unlike everything else, the attacking force of China we think is going to be between 18,000 to 22,000, as we're looking at the military balance of power estimates. and we kind of calculated how many people they could take for each landing craft and how many tanks they could put together. The CEV obviously is not great. That requires more qualitative and I believe doctrinal analysis to really figure out. And we haven't really had the opportunity to do that because I believe that'd be kind of a full-time job for us. Posture, however, we believe Taiwan would have a better posture because, as I mentioned before, there's no real opportunity for supplies in our belief. So Taiwan would be prepared to defend, and we also believe the terrain. Oh, another thing I forgot to mention, but along the whole coast, even where we don't have that kind of agriculture, a lot of it's almost urban. So you have houses built up, and these areas that won't be easy to land in or establish a beachhead in. Right, and the weather is almost perfect conditions because the only real opportunity Chinese have to cross the strait is in around April, October, and the conditions are fairly good at that time. So what we come up with is kind of a ratio of 3.74 in favor of Taiwanese forces compared to China. Again, this model is more so a proof of concept of what we're trying to do. It's not great, but my belief is that at least we can look at some of the factors that are important and put it physically in. So mobility and sophistication for us, we believe is going to be the big thing. And that's where really we think air assets will be important for China. So next is a tool that I've used a lot recently and that some of my colleagues are also working with at Concordia or that have moved on. It's Command Modern Operations, the successors to their Harpoon series. And we believe it's very useful because of the expansive nature of its database and the ability to create scenarios where we can put together different equipment, units, assets, supporting forces, and observe their interactions, which is something difficult to do in a traditional war game. We have to do all the research and put it together. This makes it much easier. We've used it to kind of falsify some of our hypotheses and make some observational analysis. Evidently, it's a air and land, naval-based game, so we can't do tactical stuff. But the reason we think it's important is because the extent of what we can do with it is kind of unmatched by any war game we've come across. So it's what we've really been working with the most. It also has a very interesting Monte Carlo feature that we can't afford, but there'll be more about that at the end. So, oh right, one thing that I will criticize about it, however, is that there's not a lot of transparency in terms of how things work, which is where you may want a traditional war game or a kind of model that you build yourself to understand the relationship. And evidently, some of the values attributed to the aircraft and systems aren't very accurate or a bit off. But yeah. So I thought it would be a great time to include this. Right, so we're looking at the chapter on modeling warfare, and one of the things that was apparent as another thing that we do a lot is use these older war games, such as Main Battle Tank, Mech War, and really anything we can come across, Tobruk. We've used those a lot even to model stuff for Ukraine, but that's another story. And one of the big things, as is mentioned in the book, is that the Cold War era focused on modeling the Soviets and had a degree of permanence and rigidity to the systems. We knew who the enemy was, and the systems would they would change from one to another, but there was a kind of permanence to them, which allowed analysis to be built together and supplant each other and really build something bigger. And there's also a mention of how they became integrated into planning and modeling and warfare modeling, which I thought was very interesting, so I wanted to include. Right. My apologies. Right, exactly. And there's also a mention of the base of sand problem, which I thought was interesting. I'm not as well versed in. I know somebody gave a presentation on it that I saw on YouTube, which was pretty good. It gave me a bit of inspiration. Yeah, essentially that the models that are created don't have a worldview in mind and aren't always accurate and just will be bound to make mistakes. So next one, please. Right, so this is the best picture I could get of the CSIS game. I wanted to look at it because I thought it was interesting, and one of the pros that I can't criticize that I think is really great that they're doing is at least they're providing the kind of an open analysis towards this that not many other people are doing. So I did appreciate that. But some of the other cons that we see are the terrain, for example, which is no longer a beach, but is a nice grassy area. The size of the hexes, which as we mentioned is 30 to 35 kilometers, and Taiwan is a small island, so it really can't be that big. The length of play, the days are about 3.5 days. A turn is 3.5 days, which we believe really is a lot to put together into one turn. And right, another issue that I found pretty apparent was their conclusion that the destruction of enemy assets, 90% of the Taiwanese air assets would be destroyed on the ground before they even got up, which I really don't believe is correct. Especially when we actually take a look at their hardened aircraft shelter and how they can hide aircraft, and even the air bases that they have on this coast, some are buried under mountains. And the whole goal of that is to have a counterattacking force once the first strike by the PLA is conducted. Another aspect is that it's led a lot by doctrine, which is it has pros and cons. I also believe that it requires more analysis that isn't purely led from our idea of how the military will react. Yeah, who's going? They also included U.S. forces, so they're also looking at U.S. doctrine and Chinese.
Both sides are operated by U.S. doctrine.
No, Chinese doctrine
Okay.
and U.S. doctrine.
Okay.
So that's interesting, but as we've seen in Ukraine, for example, it doesn't always hold up, and things don't always work out. So, all right, another thing they did do is they apparently didn't utilize technologies which hadn't demonstrated their capabilities, which I'm not entirely sure what it means and seemed a bit vague to me, but that's someplace where I would use command. Even if we don't have the accurate values, at least we can abstract something and kind of understand how things work together. We're also kind of unsure how the results were produced. So there's a big description, but there's nothing deeper about the model itself or how they're rolling dice or everything. So yeah. Finally, this is some really interesting work that I found on modeling warfare that I'm a big fan of. So the first one is command modern operations, their use of the Monte Carlo system method. And the reason that's interesting is because all our knowledge of this is going to be secondhand. Because as you'll see later, the model that you'd have to buy to have that functionality is $11,000, and the school will not lend us that. Yeah, so what they did essentially, it's not the most advanced thing, but they looked at the Falklands Islands, Falklands War, and did an engagement between Argentinian aircraft launching anti-ship missiles at British battleships, and they kind of played it out a whole bunch of times to see how it would play out, and they came up with some pretty interesting scenarios. Second one is the 300 assaults, which I thought was fascinating. It's done by 2nd Battalion, 5th Marine. They've also done some other work on Ukraine, especially in regards to how they would fight a war in Ukraine. The reason I thought this was fascinating is because they did I think it's one individual actually, who did a Monte Carlo simulation using a video game where he input the kind of factors and independent variables derived from Marine doctrine and how they would fight. So there's a deeper explanation about how they would go about fighting, and he found a way to put it in a game and simulate it over and over, 300 assaults. Came up with some very interesting conclusions there that I think we could draw from and also could use in our own analysis. This here is also interesting to me. It's a statistical approach for estimating casualty rates during combat by the Naval Health Research Center. The interest in this is that it's based mostly on resources and logistics and their resupply, as they're looking at how much medical equipment they need, how they're going to evacuate people, and we think it's kind of for our project, it's an interdisciplinary approach, how we're going to look at this, so we're trying to draw from sources everywhere. And last, we have Trevor Dupuis modeling modern warfare attrition rates for the Historical Evaluation Research Organization. This one was very interesting to us as it revealed some of the core aspects that I think are neglecting in some of these war games recently. So, for example, that dispersal offsets increased weapon lethality, especially in regards to air assets on the ground, and dispersal, ground units as well. Winners have consistently lower casualty rates, and forces with relative combat effectiveness values tend to have the lower casualties because they are more effective and less likely to incur damage due to technical or doctrinal errors. Right, and lastly, yeah, last one. Right, so this is how much command module operations cost. For the Monte Carlo version, you need the standard, which is $12,000 actually, and we're not gonna get near that for a long while. This is my ongoing project, and essentially, it's stuff like the CSIS war game and other things that I've seen kind of, I think, underrate Taiwan's own resilience and capability to defend itself. Well, there are some aspects where I believe they're unprepared. They're not totally unprepared, and this, I believe, is I forgot the name, but it's a air base on the eastern coast, and all of this is buried under a mountain. And what's not buried under a mountain has hardened aircraft shelters on a base going further south through here. So they're relatively well prepared. Lastly, a thing that something that we want to something we want to look at using is the what's it called? The U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, which did a kind of a study and analysis of Chinese tactics. And one of our next projects is trying to put that together and figuring out how it works, and hopefully putting it into a war game if we can, or a video game, just as the Marine did with the 300 assaults, and seeing how exactly we could model a beach landing. Yeah. Right. So unfortunately, I spoke a bit faster than I thought I would, but yeah, that's what we're working on for today.